Well, welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch and debriefing over the morning sessions. I'll introduce the first of two sessions that stand between us and our reception, back where we had lunch, where you'll have a sommelier curated selection of wines and some goodies as well. And hopefully we can continue that discussion leading up to tomorrow. It's my great pleasure to welcome our second keynote speaker to the conference, Dr. Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra, who holds the Alice Drysdale Sheffield Professorship in History. It seems like throughout my introduction I'll be mentioning a lot of names that are attached to his recognitions. He earned his PhD in the history of science at the University of Wisconsin. He is author and editor of 12 books and numerous research articles on a range of topics related to Atlantic history, the history of science and early modern Spanish Empire, and the colonizing ideologies of the Iberian and British empires, all topics central to the history of Western modernity. He has been a recipient of numerous honors and awards, the visiting Leverhulme Trust Professorship at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of London, the Distinguished Visiting Professorship at the University of Warwick, and a Distinguished Professorship at the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales in Quito. In 2018, the American Historical Association recognized him with the Nancy Lyman Rolker Mentorship Award. And most recently, to our surprise, delight, and interest, he is the co-author of the Hispanic Equity Report at UT Austin, documenting and reporting on structural discrimination against Hispanic faculty at his university. And this was something done on a volunteer basis by the faculty themselves. And I can say, having spoken with him a little bit just beforehand, you saw him up here, he was finishing his lecture. You are hearing something that is literally hasn't even hit the presses, it's hot off the laptop. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cañizares-Esguerra, whose keynote talk today is entitled A Land Without Water and Stones, Jesuit California Missions and 18th Century Geopolitics.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for having invited me here. I'm not a specialist on Jesuit missions. I'm not a specialist on California missions. I have, however, written on the Enlightenment and historiography on the Enlightenment. I am the author of a book called How to Write the History of the New World, which is a study of 18th century debates on epistemology, credibility, reliability, what sources to use to write the history of the Americas, the rise of conjectural history, geology, philosophical history in the Enlightenment, but also the creation of archives and new ways of reading indigenous documents and collecting notarial records, creating the so-called Archive of the Indies in Seville, etc. And so it's from that perspective and from that expertise of historiography that I am going to talk today about the California missions of Baja California and the Jesuit writings about Baja and why they are writing what they are writing. So I am taking this from the perspective of both Mexicans and Germans, particularly, and one Spaniard, that agree on many things. And I'm trying to figure out why they were writing what they were writing about Baja. That is very different from Jesuit writings on Tamaulipas or Sinaloa or any other region of the world for that matter. So Baja is peculiar. And I'm trying to figure out why that is they were writing what they were writing. And so let's begin. The Jesuit Johann Jacob Weigert, the author of these reports from the American Peninsula, California, with a twofold appendix on false reports, thought so poorly of Baja that in 1771, this is the 1772 edition that you're looking at, but the original edition is 1771, he argued that there was nothing there except thorns and rattlesnakes. Not even stones were useful, and unquote. These stones retain a great deal of moisture, and are therefore so soft that they are easily broken by the blow of an axe. They are useless as cornerstones or as doors and window frames in the construction of a building, because they easily split when exposed to the sun and pieces drop off, as happened when I built my new house. This stone or rock is the center, the heart, the substance, in a word, the principal ingredient of the whole body of California, end quote. Lime and sandstone crumble when pressed to make mortar or bricks, he argued. There were no rivers. If you look at his map, although I was trying to what should I do? Oh, this is no, I could not. How do I pass the? Okay, it's fine. Yeah, I think I already got it. Okay, so this is the map he introduced. It's the, let's see, the so-called Sac Map, and you can see that if you look carefully at the illustration that he introduced in the book, there's literally no rivers anywhere except a couple of rivers on the Pacific coast. Everything else has no rivers whatsoever. It's just rock, like Yucatan. From bottom to top, from Colorado, from the tip of the peninsula all the way to the Colorado River. And that is in the map, and this is going to become the geographical account, the mainstream geographical account of Baja California throughout the 18th century. So, let me go back to now. How do I pass these? Jesus. Okay. Oh, this is it? I'm having such a difficult time moving these. Oh, here it is. Okay, sorry. Okay. Sorry, where was? There were no rivers. There were no trees to build anything or to have smelting furnaces to extract minerals from ores. Mice, deer, and rabbits and unpredictable flash floods would wipe out any effort to tend their crops. So he would refer as to the efforts Jesuits had to create small gardens around the missions, and they would just disappear with flash floods and with all these mice that would run around eating the crops. There was only a handful of scattered hunter-gatherers over an immense peninsula, speaking mutually unintelligible languages, even within households. They went around almost naked, he argued, living in crevices in mountain rocks, drinking off succulent bushes and pitayas, forming transient sexual relations and allowing their kids to roam unattended and disciplined. Baja recounted in shocking disgust how natives collected the seeds from their own excrements and toasted them to eat them as delicatessen. Baja's dismal account of Baja are not unique. Every report I read by Germans, Spaniards, and Mexican Jesuits concurred. It's kind of a trope across all accounts. Baja was a shithole. Reading endless Jesuits' 18th century accounts of Baja California in books and letters by Germans and Mexican Creoles, one wonders why Jesuits went to Baja in the first place. Why did they dedicate so much effort to saving a few souls who they themselves, the Jesuits, consider hopeless, a big waste? The Enlightenment, I argue, largely explains why the Jesuits chose to stay. Baja was a bludgeon German and Mexican Jesuits used to clobber philosophers and radicals on their head. It was also a fortification against multiple geopolitical threats. Let me explain. The Jesuit Johann Jacob Baggert dreamed all his life to go to missions in the Americas while growing up in southern Germany. He dreamed of converting and saving indigenous souls. Sometimes in the 1540s, in the 1840s, in the 1740s, not the 1840s. In the 1740s, the order directed him to go to America. He followed the instructions and embarked on the trip first to Cadiz, then Mexico, then Sinaloa, and finally Baja, that took more than 4 years. He left Germany and arrived to the mission 4 years later. Baggert would recount his suffering throughout. In the final leg of his trip to Baja, he crossed the Gulf of California in a hollow large trunk. An indigenous barge, battling harrowing tides for almost 1 week to get to the mission of Loreto from Sinaloa, where he was ultimately greeted by 16 years of boredom and despair. Baggert found 16 Jesuits, and this is important, scattered in 13 missions. That is all there was. 16 Jesuits scattered in 13 missions. 8 were Germans, the rest Spaniards and Mexicans. Baggert crossed the width and length of the peninsula several times, the equivalent of crossing Germany 8 times, he argued. He crossed Germany up and down 8 times within 16 years. He visited every mission and every one of the 5,000 natives the Jesuits temporarily sheltered. So in the entire peninsula, there were 5,000 of them, he argued. He probably met each one of the 62 mestizo soldiers stationed in the 13 missions garrisoned to protect the Jesuits. So altogether, we are talking about 78 non-Indians in Baja California. That's it. He walked for days to visit brethren carrying sour pitayas, one of the few things from Baja diet he liked when it was mixed with sugar. That is the only thing that he liked. He also carried water in turtle pots and the cured intestines of animals, castors or deer. So the water will be in these intestines, cured intestines. So it'll be the equivalent of our water bottles today. My intestine. Think of intestines when I'm drinking this. In 16 years, Baggert found hundreds of rattlesnakes and poisonous scorpions snuck within missions' bookshelves, along with books of Jansenism and atomism he liked to read and interpret. That was 16 years of doing that. He mostly spent his time alone, walking and reading while attempting to communicate with the natives whose sleeping and eating habits he barely tolerated. Mastering the language of the natives, he argued, was hopeless. He considered that the vocabulary of Mass and Catechism amounted to just a few words. Culture and language, not race, and this is important, culture and language, not race, he argued, had rendered the natives into animals. Communicating with natives in missions was pointless. Each mission had communities of natives with 4 or 5 mutually unintelligible languages. Even women and men within ethnic groups used two completely different linguistic systems, he argued. So women would speak their own language, males would speak their own language. The language of one mission would be useless in the next. Baja even had a difficult time identifying the individual natives with whom he had lived for months. The natives, he complained, had strange diets. They could go on for days eating a few insects and seeds collected from their own shed, he argues, that terms he used. They could eat a few pitayas and be perfectly happy while emancipated. And yet these individuals would gorge for days in a row when presented with the opportunity of large animal carcasses of goats, animals introduced by the friars. The emancipated individuals could suddenly acquire new looks and becoming plump and hard to identify. So he'd say, have we met? Yes, we have been living together for the past 3 years. Baja had a difficult time identifying friendly acquaintances among the natives. No account of Jesuits in Sinaloa or Tamaulipas among the Yaqui offers such a dismal representation of a land and its peoples. None. Why Baja? What motivated Jesuits to stay? Why did Baja waste his life for the sake of a handful of native souls who seemed to be dying like flies when gathering missions? Baja sought to answer this very question himself. Quote, everything concerning California is of such little importance that it's hardly worth the trouble to take a pen and write about it. Of poor shrubs, useless thorn bushes and bare rocks, a pile of stones and sand without water or wood, of a handful of people who, besides their physical shape and ability to think, have nothing to distinguish them from animals, end quote. Why then bother? Why all the effort and sacrifice endured? His answer is simply disarmingly simple. Quote, had all the labor among the adults been fruitless, which was not always the case, the more than 14,000 young Californians who have been sent to heaven during the last 70 years is reward enough for the efforts of the missionaries, end quote. Saving souls. But this cannot be possibly true. The Jesuits were ruthless pragmatists. That is bullshit. Baja himself knew it. Quote, 1 week in a parish in a modest town in Germany would have saved more souls than a lifetime of aimless moving around in Baja California, end quote. He stated repeatedly. The answer to questions of missions of Baja California ought to be found somewhere else. Baja California was valuable for the Jesuits for at least 3 different reasons. One was imperial and geopolitical. The missions of Baja might have been desperately poor and almost deserted, but they were key at keeping the navigational routes of the North Pacific from Manila to Acapulco open, viable. The second reason was philosophical. Baja provided Jesuits like Baja alternative empirical evidence in their struggle against the rising tide of philosophical atheism and materialism. Baja used his combined experience of 16 years among the natives to ridicule Enlightenment materialists who believed in spontaneous multiple creations, the rising fashion of polygenism and scientific racism, which is odd given the things that I just described. He used his experience in California to critique the rising tide of scientific racism among the Enlightenment philosophers, to bolster the idea of culture and education over race, to explain difference. Baja also used the natives of Baja to offer scathing critiques of romantic radicals like Rousseau, whose good savages served as foils to criticize European inequality, civilization, luxury, consumption, and pedagogy. Finally, the third most important use of the missions of Baja for the Jesuits was to take on the mounting wave of critics busy exposing the wealth and power of the order as a threat to monarchies and the emerging secular nation state. The reason why they were expelled from Mexico, from Spain, from Portugal, from France, and the order was eventually abolished. They were just too powerful. To the 18th century narratives of Jesuit power, American wealth and territorial monopolies was central to the 18th century reformers like Jovellanos or all the 18th century Bourbon reformers, regalists, or royalists, actually, the Jesuit mounting power in America, wealth and so-called territorial monopolies was a threat, and that is the way they justify expulsion. To the 18th century critics of the Jesuits from Spain to Portugal to Italy to France, Paraguay was used to argue for a Jesuit monopoly over vassals and resources. Yet Baja was the most useful counter to this narrative. Baja was not Paraguay. Baja did not have large monopolies in the trade of yerba mate, land holdings, and populous missions. Baja had no well-armed and well-educated Guarani natives producing dazzling polyphonic choirs, manufacturing violins, printing types, and guns. The critics of the Jesuits cast Baja as another Paraguay. Typical 18th century European philosophical accounts would argue that there was a thriving pearl and silver economy in Baja. Jesuits made the evidence point otherwise. Baja was a shithole, not Paraguay. In the remainder of my talk, I will quickly go over each one of these three Jesuit narratives on Baja. Oh, God. How do you move these? Hello? Excuse me. How do you move these? There's no way to move it with the arrows.
Here. It goes this way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
In the remainder of my talk, I will quickly go over each one of these three Jesuit narratives on Baja. In 1757, it appeared in Madrid a multi-volume history of the Jesuits of Baja California, a typical chronicle of past missionary deeds and spiritual glories. Although the book was in fact drafted by Andrés Marcos Burriel, the powerful royal confessor of the Bourbons, it was presented as a work based on the manuscript of the Mexican Creole Miguel Venegas, Noticia de la California y de su conquista temporal y espiritual hasta el tiempo presente, the news on the spiritual and temporal conquest of California from up until today, taken from the manuscript history of Pedro Miguel Venegas, written in Mexico in 1739, and added a few maps and other notes by an anonymous author. It was Andrés Marcos Burriel, the most powerful Jesuit at the court in Madrid at the time. The primary purpose of this massive work, however, was not to establish the empirical foundations upon which to save the souls of the Indians of Baja California. It's a very odd text, actually, because it's based on the manuscript of Miguel Venegas, which is a very pious Jesuit in Mexico City who writes hagiographies of saints and hagiographies of, and a lot of sermons on Marianism and so on and so forth. And that is the foundation of the text about all these saintly pious Jesuits that are going to California. And on the other hand, there is this Machiavellian confessor, Burriel, who's not interested in any of these pieties and is interested in the global geopolitical context for why to have missions. So you have this mixing of these two traditions in one text. And so I'll be paying attention more to the notes and additions that are 2/3 of the text by Burriel and not the other 1/3 by Venegas. The primary purpose of this massive work, however, was not to establish the empirical foundations upon which to save the souls of the Indians of Baja California. No, the purpose of this work was geopolitical, to demonstrate through a careful analysis that California could easily be lost to the British and the Russians. And if lost, commercial traffic with the Philippines would also be lost. So this is a massive treatise on geopolitics and the expansion of the British and the Russians over the Pacific coast of North America. And it's based on British and French treatises, particularly the voyages of Anson in the Pacific, but also a number of French treatises. So it's a major work of geopolitics, ultimately. Too much was at stake, too much was at risk. Burriel offered a careful geopolitical analysis that drew on maps and reports of the quick expansion of the British in the Pacific, like George Anson's account of his recent exploits in the South Seas. So Burriel, and this comes also from his study, in which he reproduces many of the tropes that we just described on naked natives. Here they are sacrificing a martyr, a Jesuit martyr. They are clubbing one and burning another Jesuit. And then the animals, the natural history, etc. But his interest is ultimately geopolitical more than anything else. And he's drawing on this text, essentially, 1747, Voyage Around the World by George Anson. And he's very threatened by this expansion of the British and the French in the Pacific. For Burriel, the natural and ecclesiastical history of a place was marginal. He's not Baja, he's not this other pious Mexican Jesuit that I just described. He was marginal. The natural and ecclesiastical history of a place as marginal, depopulated and poor as was Baja, was needed in order to justify why the Jesuits should continue to strive to establish themselves in the peninsula. The latter was not easy. Baja had no water at all, he argued. Again, the same trope as Baja. There were no trees. There were not even stones with which to build. Again, Baja is going to repeat this trope over and over. Baja was as barren a peninsula of dirt with a handful of wandering savages organized into 3 distinct linguistic groups. Unlike Baja, Burriel argues there are only 3 linguistic groups. Baja would argue there were dozens of them. Why would cadres of highly literate Jesuits waste their lives saving the souls of a handful? Why not to help convert and save the souls of multitudes somewhere else? Burriel himself argued. Burriel demonstrated the key geopolitical location of the southernmost missions of Baja. The oceanic currents of the Pacific connecting Manila to Mexico forced ships to inch their way down the coast of the peninsula. Baja was a key logistical outpost in the trade with Asia. Without Baja, there was no Manila. It was Burriel's keen geopolitical analysis that made his multi-vol, and without Baja, there was no Manila, but also there was no northern mines of Mexico either, because the British and the Russians were inching their way down. So they needed control over this peninsula in order to stop the expansion of the British and the Russians. It was Burriel's keen geopolitical analysis that made this multi-volume history an international success. It was translated into several languages, including English, 1759, Natural and Civil History of California. And again, there is no interest whatsoever on the section on piety by the Mexican Creole, and the translation is focused mostly on Buriel's additions. Then it was translated into Dutch in 1762, and finally into French in 1767. Buriel's mid-18th century global generous vision of the missions of California gave way in the late 18th century to a different tradition. A local, parochial, overly concerned with establishing the accuracy of empirical detail histories. Typical of this new approach is the history of the missions by the Mexican Jesuit in exile, Francisco Clavijero. Historia de la California, opera póstuma, published posthumously in Venice in 1789. This is one of the hundreds of Creole Jesuits in exile in the Papal States from 1768 on, that created numerous histories of Spanish America, and Clavijero is writing a history of California among the many writings he produced. Clavijero's history is interested in getting the details right. Are there stones in Baja? Are there trees? Is there water? Are there pearls? Those are the questions he's answering. It's not saints and piety and hagiographies and the operation of missions. Do the natives go naked? The purpose of his narrative is ultimately to settle Enlightenment polemics. The Jesuits did not extract untold riches from California because there were none to be had. To the claims that there was a brisk trade of pearls, Clavijero demonstrated that there was nothing more, that was nothing more than a story, that there was nothing more to that story than innuendo. To the claim that the Jesuits grew rich controlling parts of the trade that came from Manila in exchange for supplying ships with gear and food, Clavijero demonstrated that it was all falsehood. A place without trees could not be a port to have ships repaired. Clavijero spent a long time demonstrating that Baja was no hub to resupplying shipping. There was no wood, and therefore coopers to fix casks and barrels. To build, stones were brought as cargo across the Sea of Baja from Sinaloa. That was the source of stones for the missions. It wasn't local stones. There were no rivers, and therefore little in the way of agriculture and commerce. There was nothing. So to the critics of the Enlightenment that argue that Baja was the source of pearls and silver and riches and vassals for the Jesuits that allow them to grow and maintain their prestige and their wealth and remain a threat to the monarchies of Europe, he used Baja as a counter. Details about the nature of the natives mattered because they shed light on the lengths to which the Jesuits were willing to sacrifice themselves for the salvation of a handful of souls, he argued. Unlike Buriel, Clavijero had no sense of the geopolitical in the Pacific. That is not his concern. Clavijero's Baja is inspected microscopically without regard for larger narratives, oblivious to any questions of method or theory. Clavijero is the antithesis of Buriel. It's not a philosophical history. Clavijero's narrative, like Baguerre's, was the massive compilation of empirical evidence to defend the order from chargers of vast American economies of scale, from Paraguay to Baja. A counter-Enlightenment treatise. Clavijero's exacting empirical and granular natural and moral history of Baja California was identical to that offered by Baguerre 19 years before in 1771 and 1772. God. The mystery. Sorry.
It's okay. You move it over to the side and then
Yeah, I am trying to do that, but yeah.
There it is.
Oh, there you found it.
There.
There you go. Thanks. So here's the same map that appears in every treatise in the 18th century, this early 1730s map of California that shows Baja, without water, without rivers, as a dry peninsula of rock, like Yucatan. Okay, so the point was no other than to present Baja as the antithesis of Paraguay. A land lacking entirely in wood, water, even mortar and bricks to build. Baja did not have even shade to give away. Like Clavijero, another Mexican Jesuit, Miguel del Barco, also wrote a treatise in exile in Bologna in the 1780s to document in the greatest of empirical detail the miseries of Baja. Like Baguert and Clavijeros, Del Barco's manuscript strives for granular detail as it seeks to render Baja into the antithesis of Paraguay. Again, it's a trope and a strategy, anti-enlightenment strategy that repeats itself over and over. Now, let's go to the third strategy that is more interesting. The case of Baguert, unlike Barcos and Clavijero, is more complex. In his 1771 printed treatise, Baguer goes beyond simply the defense of the Jesuit order. His goal is more complex. Let's listen to him. Why do I write about a useless region? Quote, to tell the truth. First, because the old world decides information, and California forms no small part of that new world. First reason. There is demand for information, I am offering it. Second, because all the modern geographers and cosmologists, because there are all modern geographers and cosmologists, and they talk about it, and none of them tells the truth. Second reason. Third, because a short time ago, the same California caused a great deal of clamor because of its imaginary riches. So the third reason is the one that we have been discussing, namely the same point made by Clavijero and Del Barco, that this was no Paraguay, there were no vassals, there was no monopoly of wealth, there is no pearl trade, there is no silver mines, there are no riches to be had. This is all imaginary riches. Fourth, because in Europe one hears, and this is important, this is the point I was trying to make, because in Europe one hears and reads with equal interest of the poverty and misery as of the abundance and wealth of the stupidity and animal-like existence as of the accomplishments and good government of peoples beyond the ocean. I repeat again, because in Europe one hears and reads with equal interest of the poverty and misery as of the abundance and wealth, of the stupidity and animal-like existence, as well as of the accomplishments and good government of peoples beyond the oceans. I decided to accede to the demands of my good friends and other respected persons, and do a short description of the land and other things connected with it, to satisfy the cravings, curiosity of the public, as well as to refute the falsehoods and defamations of some writers. So what does he mean by defamations of some writers? It's namely the philosophers. For Baguer, California is useful to correct misrepresentations of American missions as source of territory, vassals, and resources for Jesuits desirous to impose corporate religious papal absolutism on the emerging secular nation state. So he goes over all these reasons, says no, not at all. This is what Baguer has to say about the legendary California pearl trade, the source of much Jesuit economic power, alleged Jesuit economic power. Quote, the whole California pearl fishing amounts to this. Every year in the summertime, 8, 6, or 12 poor Spaniards, who the whole lot of them own nothing but whatever they earn by hard labor, as for instance, discharged soldiers and a few others like them come from Sonora, Sinaloa, and other places of the Mexican mainland opposite the shore of California. 12 poor Spaniards. They come in little boats or skiffs, hoping to make a small fortune and bring with them a supply of corn, several hundred pounds of stone-dried beef, and some Mexican Indians who are willing to die for pearls. For the Californian natives have shown up to now no desire to risk their lives for a few yards of cloth, end quote. That is all the pearl trade. 12 poor Spaniards. Yet Baja also wants California as a foil to critique all the new philosophical theories on the origins of civilization, inequality, hierarchies, and political economy. This is what Baja offers to the Scottish theories of political economy, namely the unintended consequences, wealth as the unintended consequence of the pursuit of self-interest, and theories of wealth as the result of division of labor and the multiplication of subjective needs as the engine of progress. These are the foundations of Adam Smith's political economy. What is his answer to that? Quote, the California natives seem to have nothing, and yet they have all the times whatever they need and as much as they need of it. That is because they do not care to shoot the arrow of their ambition farther than after whatever their poor country produces, and that they are always able to reach. Therefore, it's no miracle that hardly one among them has gray hair, and they only very late in life, and then only very late in life, that they always are in good spirits, and that they joke and laugh continually. This perpetual gaiety is a clear proof that they are always contented, always joyful, which without doubt makes for real happiness. So the entire moral economy of Adam Smith collapses before the evidence of how the natives of Baja behave. His very ideas of the natives as savages and animals is used to undermine materialism, polygenism, and scientific racism, a growing fashion in the Enlightenment. All central ideas to the materialism of the philosophers. Quote, as a general rule, it may be said that California Indians are awkward, rude, unclean, insolent, ungrateful, mendacious, thievish, abominable, lazy, great talkers to their end, and naive and childlike so far as intelligence and actions are concerned. They are an unreflecting people without worries and concern, a people who possesses no self-control, but follow, like animals, in every respect, their natural instincts. Nevertheless, quote, the Californian Indians and all other American natives are human beings, true children of Adam, as we are. They have not grown out of the earth or stones like moss or other plants as shameless freethinkers and greater liars than all the Indians combined will have us believe. At least I never saw one growing like that, or ever heard of any of them who originated in that particular manner, end quote. Finally, Baja used the education of children among the natives to club Rousseau on the head. Children, he argued, behave with total disregard for the needs of elders. Quote, may God further enlighten the Indians and preserve Europe, and especially Germany, from rearing children in the Indian manner, which in part corresponds to the plan outlined by that base-minded zealot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his Emile, and also to the moral teachings of some modern philosophers belonging to the same fraternity. They would like to have temptations and instincts run their course freely, end quote. Baja concluded that culture and education was the cause of indigenous behaviors, not race. I am running out of time. I would like to conclude by introducing drawings of another Jesuit whose views of missions of Baja contrast rather radically with all those of the Jesuit writers I have exposed today. It is the case of Ignacio Tersch, the Jesuit Czech, whose 1760 drawings of California at the University of Prague offer us a more humane, less ideological perspective of California. Oh, this is Baja engravings. But this is Tersch. This is natural history of Ignacio Tersch. Here you have the same emphasis on thorns that you find in Baja. I mean, natural history of plants in which plants have exceedingly long thorns. But his point is not to highlight the dismal nature of natural history, simply to draw the plants. This is Tersch, and again, more natural history of plants. Mollusks and shells. Birds, both Clavijero and Bagert would argue that birds are rare in California, and yet Tersch finds them in nature with insects and flowers. Animals, rams and leopards, and plants, and then warfare among the natives, natives near missions, and natives transformed in missions. Natural history collection of tunas in cactuses, and then the missions themselves, which come across as very different from the representations offered by Bagert and Clavijero and Del Barco, strikingly different. The buildings of the missions, and that's it. So there are, among the same Jesuits, there are at least two dominant perspectives. One is the perspective of Burriel, that is geopolitical, and the other is the perspective of Clavijero and Del Barco, that emphasize this kind of painstaking, detailed histories of the place in order to undermine Enlightenment narratives of Jesuit power and to undermine Enlightenment narratives of the origins of wealth and civilization and pedagogy and human difference. And finally, the last version of the Jesuit narratives of Baja California is that by Ignacio Tersch, that is essentially a narrative of images, not a written narrative that reflects a very different Baja than the one the other three writers offer. So in just half a century, you have these very different accounts of Baja that explain largely why the Jesuits decided to stay in that land, even though they emphasize in their accounts repeatedly that it was a land that was useless. Thank you.
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Jorge. So when you were talking about Baja, it sounded to me like Florida in the Pacific from a geopolitical perspective. That is, the Spanish there say, or in fact, scholars say of the Spanish, that they don't really care to be there that much, but they need to be there because the plate fleet is leaving, passing Florida, and various other people have their eye on Florida, thinking of it as a place to grab ships as they go by. And so, you know, they remove the French colony that's there, and then they plant. And so would you say the geopolitics is similar? And on the one hand, it's the mineral wealth, and on the other hand, it's the connection to Manila that makes these two outposts important places despite their characteristics?
Yeah, it is very similar, although the point here is not so much that they are geopolitically important. Sonora was also geopolitically important for the Spanish monarchy and the Jesuits, although you don't have accounts of Sonora like Burriel's, in which it's all pragmatic, sheer instrumentality. You don't have accounts of the Franciscans in Florida that are Machiavellian in terms of geopolitical instrumentality. None. In the case of Franciscans, you have all these pious hagiographies of saints and all the wonderful things they are doing, and et cetera, et cetera. So what makes the Jesuit accounts of the 18th century distinct is that they are self-reflectively geopolitical. And they explain brazenly, this is a land, a useless land. We don't care about its resources. I mean, we don't want to be here, and yet we have to be here. And we need to invest and send people, et cetera, because there is a larger purpose. So in that sense, it's very similar to Acosta's account of Peru, the Procurandi Diorum Salute of Acosta in the 1580s in Peru is a striking text, just like Burruel's, in that Acosta argues that the indigenous natives of Peru are vassals, and therefore they have rights, and because they are vassals, they have to be free. It's within notion of vassalage to be free, and if they are not free, the Spanish king becomes a tyrant. And yet he introduces the notion, he doesn't do it, but Toledo, the Viceroy Toledo introduces the mita, forced labor, rotational labor to go to the mines, which is the antithesis of freedom. And so Acosta says, well, there are larger issues at stake here, and larger issues are geopolitical. And so without the mines and without silver in Peru, we have no empire, we have no global empire. And therefore, even though it's wrong and unjustified to have the natives working mitas, we need them to work in mitas because we have to subordinate the needs of theological needs, local theological needs, to the larger goal of the monarchy, which namely is defeat the Ottomans and defeat the Protestants, and we need the silver of Peru. So we might as well have mitas, even though it's horrible. So it's a large geopolitical text, a large geopolitical vision that justifies, in geopolitical terms, local needs. The same for Burriel. So you have that type of Jesuit arguments that are not untypical. So that's what makes it different from whatever the Franciscans are saying about Florida.
Thank you for your talk. I found I was thinking a lot about books when you were talking. If Begat, is that his name? If Begat spent 60 years in Baja. 16. What was he reading? Do we know about his library? How did he have contact with the work of Voltaire and Rousseau? Did he read it before he went? Did he have a book subscription service? Before arriving?
Yeah.
Do we know anything about the books he had when he was in Baja? Did he bring a library?
Yes, we have.
Was it substantial?
He describes books, yes, the titles. I don't remember exactly. He talks about Jansenism a lot.
Yeah.
He talks about atomism.
It sounded like he was very up to date.
Yes.
So he traveled with the trunk of books.
What?
He traveled with the trunk of books.
No, he's not his books. He's the missions library.
Oh, the mission library.
Yeah, it's not his. They are there for the others 15
edification.
Jesuits.
Okay.
For the other 15 Jesuits. This is also important. I mean, this says that these are concentration camps in which you have these armies of bureaucrats and whatever forcing the natives to behave. It makes no sense. The Jesuits and Baguette, it's hopeless before the natives. Says the natives do not follow instructions. They do not listen to what I say. They just come in and out of the missions whenever they want. They use the mission seasonally, and then they leave and they come back. He complains constantly about the natives not following instructions by missionaries. And again, the missionaries are 16 over, 1,000 miles, or 800 miles of peninsula. I don't know how many miles there are in California, but I mean, 62 soldiers all together. So we're talking about 72 Europeans. In fact, 62 of them are mestizos, are not Europeans.
Right.
What else can I say?
Thank you.
No, thank you for that. As you were going through, something that was really striking me as you gave an account of this writing, which is an inventory and assessment of assets. And it's structured around a set of questions or premises about what an asset is that in many ways does not require any dialogue with the native population. And it strikes me that what you map out is this kind of shift in perspective from a knowledge production that's oriented around metaphysical questions toward ones that is going to become increasingly scientific. It's about how do you accurately measure and predict for the purpose of exploitation. And then within that process, you're showing different types of agendas and kind of mapping that out. So I want to kind of put back, since you have written the book, as it were, on methodology, this is the question of the conquest and of the colonial period. How can we gain access to that other history, which is of the indigenous population, the population that is not part of and is resisting the colonial kind of control of a region? What is there in the documents that exist, and what is it that is missing that might be found?
Well, for the literature on Baja, the literature the Jesuits are producing on Baja, it might be very different from the literature they are producing for other missions. There is no scientific interest or natural history that is clear. They are not looking for resources. They just give up. Baja is not a place to find new plants. I mean, they do describe these peculiar fruits and these bushes that are rich in water. And they do describe the ethnography of natives and how they carry water and how they handle these environments, etc. But the interest is not a description of natural history and of itself. It's the opposite, is to prove that this is not, there's nothing useful in this space. There are no medicines, there are no particular drugs, right? Like in Paraguay, yerba mate or whatever, peculiar animals that might be useful, certain drugs that might come from animals or from minerals. That is not the interest of these individuals. Their interest is ideological. Baja becomes this argument to counter the narrative of Jesuits as powerful threat to the monarchies in Europe. So it is a very, very, and this is what I've been trying to emphasize, is a very unique genre compared to other accounts of they have, and because their account is not one of dominance and power over a region, you see their constant complaint that they have no power over the natives. So I would use these sources actually to reconstruct if that was my intention, to reconstruct how the natives are actually using the Jesuit missions for their own purposes. As I just said, it's 16 Jesuits we're talking about. I mean, and 62 soldiers scattering 13 missions. Their power cannot be that great over the natives, and they emphasize that repeatedly. We have little power over the natives. So, yeah.
Okay, I have a comment question, which is, in general, the Spaniards and religion had to do with feudal economy, right? So saving a soul is like integrating a peasant to the feudal economy. these are concepts and not only concepts, but social relations that are ideologies that are function very well integrated. So when you save the soil in Paraguay or in central Mexico, it's worth to save it because you're saving the whole agricultural economy that already was there when the Spaniards arrived. And you're incorporating it to the imperial power of a feudal society. And in that sense, I can very well understand why they would see Baja as something worthless, because there was no economy there. It's the social factor. You have no feudal potential to root there and have a local economy that deserves to be controlled.
But
So-
you say that also of Sinaloa or other places, Tamaulipas.
Yeah, well, this was probably an extreme, but it's like a prototype, if you will, in this process. It had even less resources than Sinaloa or Sonora, and therefore less potential for agricultural control and no central economy or centralized. And
Is there a question?
yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was just wondering if you could offer some clarification about the vast category of philosophers that you're referring to, because you do pretty, fluidly move from Rousseau and Voltaire to Smith, who of course hasn't been published, Wealth of Nations until 71, 72. And I'm struggling because I think, given the specificity of the writings on Baja California that you're walking us through, there's a way in which knowledge of natives becomes sort of mixed into this monolithic category in terms of what the philosophers are reading. And of course, through the 1740s, through the 70s in particular, what the natives more broadly, that they're often referring to the ones on, along the St. Lawrence River, and in particular, knowledge that's coming out in the wake of the 7 Years' War. And Smith undergoes significant revision across the 6 editions of Theory of Moral Sentiment. So I'm just struggling a little bit with a generalization that you're invoking about the philosophers in what allegedly some of these accounts are countering, when in fact we're also trying to work through a very different picture of what the Enlightenment's understanding and polemics about this is, and just right down to the fact that, this isn't, polygenicism versus monogenicism are themselves contested categories, and then 1770s with the Encyclopedia Britannica, that becomes a reprise, a debate that's reprised within the Scottish Enlightenment itself. So I guess I'm just saying that, are we, I think one of the things I value about conferences and gatherings like this is that it puts pressures on those of us who are historians of Europe to not make monolithic assumptions about what is the category of the native that so-called European thinkers are invoking. And this seems to risk falling back into some of that as well.
Right. So you don't want me to make generalizations about the category of philosophers?
I see you are doing that.
Yeah, well, it's the historical actors who are doing it. That's what they are saying.
But they're not internally consistent. So I guess that's why I was having
I think that's okay. That is what histories are. The documents are. They are not internally consistent. I don't know of any
agree.
historically consistent
But
document.
that's what's making it difficult to understand what it is that they're the Baja accounts are countering them.
Oh, well, they have a stereotype of what the philosophers are saying about human nature, and they are using their experience in Baja to say that is bullshit.
So this is understanding on what the Jesuits are stereotyping about the philosophers.
Yeah, of course, the Jesuits are stereotyping the philosophers. We know that. It's called the counter-enlightenment, yes. Yeah.
No, I just want to make sure, because you are then putting words into Adam Smith as well.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, I am putting words on. What do you mean I am putting words on?
Well, because you're just, at one point you were like, and this is Adam Smith's whole theory, which is also not consistent across.
Well, the theory of Adam Smith is the unintended consequences of self-interest.
And across various editions of Theory of Moral Sentiment, he undergirds that as well.
Sure, but it's the unintended consequence of self-interest, and and this unlimited aspect of human nature to multiply needs that lead to more consumption. I think that doesn't change in the 7 or 18 editions of Adam Smith. That doesn't change in all the editions of Adam Smith. That is consistent. And so they are building on that inside and saying, look, I mean, this is, it's more complicated. It's still central to our categories of political economy, this notion of human nature, the driver of wealth. And they're saying, no, there are other human societies in which that is not really true.
No, I agree with that. I'm just saying that I don't think that's the foundational category necessarily. But this is what we're seeing.
We have to be sensitive with white European ideologues. Yes.
I have a question.
One more question. We are past our time a little bit.
Are we actually in agreement that you said there were 60 Jesuits and 52 soldiers?
62, yeah.
Or the other way around, okay. And I think that they were very powerful, actually. Spanish presence in the region, and there's an attestment to that. But what would you say about someone who says that, I mean, is there power? You're saying there's powers in the numbers because there were so few Europeans. That means they couldn't, by definition, have.
The 62 soldiers were not Europeans.
Right. Okay. Even so. So what were you saying then?
Jesuits.
Can you clarify that for me, please?
There
Then.
were 8 European Germans.
Okay.
The rest were not European.
So then, but you said it a few times in your talk that they didn't have power over the indigenous
Well,
peoples.
they obviously had power, but it wasn't overwhelming. There was they couldn't have the natives do things they wanted the natives to do. They couldn't. It was a very weak state. I mean, 62 mestizo soldiers, poorly fed and badly paid, were not an standing army of any power, I would say.
Well, but you don't need a power to have power. I mean, like, we could talk about the 1% right now, and they're very few, but they have, like, ton of power over all of us. But
Your point is that they were powerful.
I think so. I think they were very powerful, and I think that back to the question that you had actually about how can we see it from the other side, like what material culture, I think that what I do as a scholar, at least for example, is that I definitely read these accounts that you were reading to us today, and then I read between the lines when they're talking about not understanding their diet or they definitely had, obviously they had a system, an economic, cultural system that worked for them. And so I think that more to the questions that were being said, it's like we need to understand it from that point of view. As in, like, we may not understand that system, and me, I've been raised in the West too, so I have that, and I have to fight that all the time. But I think that when we read the accounts from the Jesuits, I think if we read between the lines, and then we look at the material culture that remains, I think that that's when we can see those voices that you were asking about. That is precisely how we can do that. And in fact, just recently, and I'll close with this, I was reading the accounts of, I had my class read the accounts of Columbus. And they were saying, my God, these people are so savage. They run around naked. And all they do is they paint their bodies. And they do contraptions on their hair. And I asked my students, okay, there you have it. This is what people in the Caribbean were doing. This is how they were dressing. And I had a class, and my advisor, I still haven't recuperated, obviously, but from what I went through, but I said, oh, I described an image. It was like, they're naked, and then she stopped and said, Helen, why are you saying they're naked? And she said, oh, they seem to be naked to me. She said, do you think that they think they're naked? And it was like, oh, it was an amazing teaching moment for me, in which I have to figure it out from their perspective, whether they think they're naked, whether they think they don't have a culture or civilization, in spite of what the US do it. But I think that those accounts are very fundamental to understanding what you were asking. At least that's my methodology. I'd love to hear another one, but at least that's how I go about it.
Well, these discourses are discourses, and discourses seek to interpret and demean these populations and explain and justify whatever they are doing there. Whether the natives actually believed that they were naked, obviously not, because they didn't change their clothing. They kept on using whatever they were using, and the natives, well, again, some of them might have changed their cultural behavior, some of them did not. I think most of them did not. So, in any way. Okay, thank you.